This is another lecture in the series Principles of Ethics, created for philosophy classes at Shenandoah University. This lecture concerns the fourth of our 5 principles, the principle of justice.
Philosophers have distinguished 3 distinct but interrelated accounts of what justice requires of us. Some emphasize that justice requires us to treat people as they deserve to be treated. Others would emphasize the idea of entitlement. Justice requires us to give people all that to which they are entitled. But its most basic meaning may simply be fairness. Treat people fairly. Of course, it will require a lot of thought, a lot of work on our part to figure out what it is people deserve, what they are entitled to, and what fairness means in a variety of contexts. Early in the course, I drew a distinction between personal and social morality or ethics. Personal morality has to do with our individual choices, but social morality examines the policies and behaviors of institutions, especially large and complex ones like the economy or the government. Justice is particularly relevant to the evaluation of institutions. We want to be sure that our institutions give people everything to which they are entitled, give them their just deserts, treat people fairly. This is especially relevant with reference to what are called basic institutions, our economy, the government, our political system. These, we believe, should be fair and just, giving people all that to which they are entitled. From the beginning of philosophical reflection on justice, a close relationship has been recognized between justice and equality, and we still believe that justice and equality are closely related. The first philosopher to attempt to define justice was probably Aristotle. He defined justice as treating equals equally and unequals unequally. That's what's called a formal principle of justice. It doesn't tell us specifically what to do, but it tells us how to think about questions of justice. What this formal principle requires us to do is to determine in what respects persons are equal and in what respects they are unequal or different, particularly ways in which they are unequal or different that justify differential treatment. That is to say, that means that particular people deserve different things from others or are entitled to different things than others. That treating them fairly would be treating them differently rather than equally. You are probably familiar with these words from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Notice, after making that affirmation, the Declaration quickly ties it to an account of what government is for. Clearly, the Declaration believes that our most basic institution, the government, should be just. Here I want you to think especially about its affirmation that all people, I think that's what Mr. Jefferson actually meant, all people are equal. Does that mean that all people are exactly the same? Is that what he was affirming? If so, it would appear to be patently absurd. No, people are not all exactly the same. But when the Declaration said that all people are equal, it was saying that all people are the same in certain morally relevant ways. There are essential ways that we are identical, and those ways require that we all be treated equally in some important respects, that we have equal rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it also means that many of those differences that have been used to justify treating people differently are wrong. Sometimes people of a different race or a different gender or a different class or a different family background have been treated differently. Those things, according to our affirmation of human equality, would seem to be wrong. What this commitment to justice as equality requires of us is that we figure out exactly in what respects we are all equal, in what respects we are all the same, and what the implication of that sameness is for how we are treated. How is this sameness or equality morally relevant? What does it imply with respect to the equal treatment that we believe somehow that all of us deserve? That's the burden. How are we equal, and what is the relevance of that equality or sameness? Identifying the morally relevant ways in which we are all the same, or all equal, implies as well then that we've begun to understand what differences among us do in fact justify differential treatment. So, in what sense are we equal? There are certain classic philosophical answers to that question, and you will recognize the answers I propose here as ideas you've already heard in this course. One of the most influential answers to the question, how are we all equal, is the idea that we all share a capacity for self-transcendence and autonomous rationality. This does not mean we are all equally intelligent, but what it does mean is that as human beings, we all are capable of thinking for ourselves. We can step back from the ways in which we've been shaped by our parents, our culture, our experiences, and think for ourselves. Each of us can form our own individual autonomous life plan, consistent with our particular understanding of what life is about. More poetically, we might say every individual has their own distinctive hopes, dreams, aspirations, and fears. All this grounded in that capacity for self-transcendence. Many philosophers would argue this is the most essential characteristic that defines human nature. This is that aspect of what we are that must be acknowledged and respected if we are to live moral lives, if we are to have just institutions. Of course, there are other ways that all human beings are equal, and I would argue that we must recognize all of these ways in which we are equal or the same to come to a complete and full account of our equality and of justice. We are all alike in that we are all equally vulnerable to injury or death. We share as human beings not simply the capacity for self-transcendence and autonomous rationality, but we also share a common fragility and mortality. We are easily hurt. We are easily killed. As well, we are social creatures. We are all dependent on others, not just for our survival, but for our happiness, for our flourishing as human beings. We need each other. We yearn for connection with each other. We yearn for friendship. We yearn for supportive community. We yearn for justice. In these respects, all three of these respects, all human beings are the same. Now, suppose that we were to agree on this three-part account of the ways in which we are all the same. The next thing we have to figure out is what this means with respect to how we should all be treated, what these common features of our humanity mean with respect to the equal treatment, the fairness that justice requires. One of the things you might have already thought about, and I hope you'll notice, is that the commitment to equality that I'm speaking of here is reflected already in the idea that our moral principles apply equally to all people. That was one of the underlying convictions I named behind this approach that we're using in the class. And when I began to describe the ways in which we are equal, I said to you that you would have heard these ideas before. All the principles we've already considered were grounded in exactly these aspects of our nature that I've named here as the ways in which we are equal. So you might say equality and justice as equality has already been built into the account of the moral principles we're using here. But what the principle of justice adds, I think, to what we've already said, is the institutional or systemic dimensions. That is to say, the presence of a principle of justice within our system points to our particular concern about the way institutions and systems of institutions affect our lives. We are particularly concerned that institutions respect human dignity, that treat all of us with that equal respect that all of us deserve, given these common features of our humanity. Our commitment to justice as equality, to the idea that all people are equal, does not mean for us that we should all be treated exactly the same way in every context or situation. For example, I doubt that any of you believe that everyone in the class should get exactly the same grade. You should all have the same opportunity to get your very best grade. I should not discriminate against you because of your race or your gender or your beliefs and background. Similarly, our commitment to equality has not resulted in the idea that all of us should have exactly the same income or wealth. And we don't seem to believe that all should have exactly the same political power, the same social and institutional status. We allow some people to have more power over us politically, but we do believe that everyone of age should have the opportunity to participate in the process of deciding who has greater power over us. So our commitment to justice as equality does not mean that we should all be treated exactly the same way all the time. But it does mean that we should be particularly attentive to the ways in which institutions and systems of institutions treat us. We should be particularly attentive, given our history as human beings, even our history in this country, to the ways in which institutions and systems of institutions treat us differently on the basis of irrelevant differences among us, differences having to do with race, gender, and religious or political beliefs. Justice and equality require us to think carefully about, for example, our understanding of marriage and the home and the family, and our beliefs about differences between men and women. Many people believe that our beliefs and the practices associated with those beliefs have resulted in systematic discrimination against women, a systematic discrimination that violates our very commitment to justice and equality. Matters certainly worth considering. Our commitment to justice as equality has settled a variety of issues. The vast majority of us, not all of us for sure, reject racism. A significant majority of us reject sexism. For example, we are all pretty much committed to the idea that all citizens should have a right to participate in political processes. But there are certain significant unresolved issues. For example, is there a right to some basic level of income and wealth? Surely our commitment to justice as equality has not meant for us that all should have exactly the same income. But is there a right to some basic level of income and wealth? That is to say, some level of income and wealth that would guarantee people's access to food and housing and health care. That's a part of what we are arguing about in the current debate over health care reform. Is the fact that there are people among us who are hungry, who are homeless, who are without access to adequate health care, are those matters only of beneficence or charity? That is to say, do we as individuals have an imperfect duty to do something about that? Or are they matters of justice and rights? Matters that require us as a community, through our institutions, to resolve this inadequate access to food, shelter, and health care. Well, hopefully these remarks have provided you an adequate introduction to the idea of justice and the principle of justice. Let me conclude these remarks by talking about some of the distinct types or aspects of justice that philosophers have identified. Philosophers often talk about distributive and economic justice. Distributive justice has to do with the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens that are produced as a result of our interactions and relationships through our institutions. Economic justice is particularly focused on income and wealth, as these are distributed in a society through its economic institutions. Retributive justice has to do with just or fair punishment in response to a crime. That will be the focus of our discussion when we consider capital punishment. Is execution a fair and just punishment for the crime of murder? Compensatory justice has to do with whether and what compensation is owed to someone who is a victim of injustice or a crime. The issue of affirmative action raises the matter of compensatory justice. What is owed to black people in the United States because of the historic discrimination they have suffered in this country? Procedural justice has to do with the fairness of the administration of institutional policies and rules. We could ask ourselves whether the policies and rules are fair, but we could also ask whether they are administered and applied fairly and properly. If we were to discover that good rules were administered. This concludes our initial consideration of the principle of justice. Our next podcast will look at the question of rights, the relationship between the idea of rights and justice.